welcome to Writing the Wrong Way, where we talk about how writing works, how writers work, and how the best writers risk being strange. And I have here one of my good friends, Keith Cadieux, who was visiting my class at the University of Winnipeg. So what we're going to hear is the recording excerpted from the class that we did at the University of Winnipeg. So thank you to the University of Winnipeg for helping me host Keith Cadieux. Thank you to Keith Cadieux for participating, and to all the students for their great questions. Primarily here, I'm just asking student questions and a few of my own questions, or synthesizing student questions. So really, you have to give them the credit. And this is a longer interview, so I've split into two parts. So next week, you can hear part two. But for right now, please enjoy part one, talking to Keith Cadieux.
So I'm Keith, another writer and editor in Winnipeg. I deal mostly with horror, or that's what I'm most interested in for sure. I have a couple of smaller books that have been published that are my fiction, and then I've edited a horror anthology as well as a horror series through the Winnipeg Writers Festival, which was an event where 4 writers stayed overnight in a supposedly haunted house. And then we published the stories that came out of that. That's pretty much in terms of why Jonathan asked me to be here, I hope. Thanks for having me.
So Keith is not only, has published, horror novel Gaze. He has a edited horror fiction as well. Published that edited horror collection. He's one of our local horror writers. He just published a new book. I don't know if you call it a chapbook or what you would call it precisely, but a short story kind of in book form called Signal Noise. Did I say that right? Signal Decay, sorry. And then
it's a chapbook, a novelette.
It's really an excellent, short little book. And, he's a short story collection. He's completed and shopping around at the moment. And Keith also, the other reason I just wanted to have Keith here is he's one of the people that I know, probably the person I know, one or two people I know who has the kind of largest wealth of horror knowledge and just, an insightful kind of take on horror. So I've got some questions from people who couldn't be here. And then of course there are people who are here. So maybe we'll just kind of turn it over to questions for the moment. Although I'd like to just ask one question first from a student who isn't here, because I think it is a nice intro into the overall discussion. And this is Megan, who was wanted to know, what is it that drew you to begin writing horror? And were there any authors in particular that kind of inspired you the most, inspired you to write in this genre? But overall, what kind of drew you most to writing horror, and then specifically what authors are kind of the touchstones or inspirations for you?
Sure. I have always been into horror, even from when I was a little kid. I was probably into it much earlier than is socially acceptable. My dad is a big horror fan also, so I saw a lot of scary movies when I was a kid that I probably shouldn't have seen. That definitely left an imprint. So I was a big fan of Stephen King from a very young age, mostly from I would watch the movies and then I would go and read those books as a teenager. When I started writing horror fiction myself, I sort of gravitated to that early on, that I wanted to do scary stuff, but I was in a creative writing program at university and they sort of beat that out of you, or they still they still were at that point. So I sort of drifted into more realist but still very dark, and then swung right back to doing full-on horror again. I think what draws me to it is the ability to deal with subject matter that maybe is harder to do in a realist fashion, or is simply too too hard for like that people don't want to deal with in terms of a realist story, that it might be too dark. But in horror you sort of have this carte blanche to delve into dark topics about how human beings work, and or how they don't, how society purports to function, but it doesn't really work that way. And horror allows you to really delve into stuff like that and to explore feelings more of like dread and when things don't work out. And I think that's one of the only modes that really allows things to not wrap up well. Like a horror story that has a really bad, nasty ending is acceptable, and it's not in anything else. And I think the real world has a lot more nasty endings than it does happy endings, and that is something that has drawn me to horror and that I like exploring when I'm writing it myself.
Keith, there's another sort of question that Kirsten had that I think is a nice tie to this one, which is just as somebody who spends your time writing and editing horror stories, do they actually still have an effect on you in the same way that they used to? Or that they might on a non-horror writer. She's sort of wondering what the difference is between, since the in and outs of horror, has it's lost its ability to scare you?
I think it's harder. It's harder to scare me now, but it still does happen. So like I had said that I watched a lot of things when I was a kid that were scary, but often it would be surprising what actually bothered me and what didn't. So sometimes like something really, really scary wouldn't get to me. And then I'd watch an actual not horror movie that just had a scene in it that was really nasty, and that would stay with me and I wouldn't be able to shake it. So I still love to absorb lots of horror. I watch a lot of garbage movies from like Amazon and Tubi and stuff that I just have on in the background while I'm working. But so I'm sort of rarely scared, but I still am. It certainly does still happen that I will encounter something that is unsettling and that stays with me like long afterwards. But it just takes a little bit more actual spreading out and looking for more stuff. But it does still happen for sure. But
When's the
a
last
lot
time
of
it
more.
happened? What's the last example you can, like, really specific thing that happened?
I guess, and sometimes it happens like again unexpectedly. So I watched, and now I'm not going to be able to remember what it was called, but I watched an Indonesian found footage horror movie. It was called something simple like The Asylum or something. It was on Shudder, and it was like super cliched idea that it's a bunch of teenagers who have a streaming show that are going to stay overnight in an abandoned insane asylum. Super old, tired idea, but just some of the scares that they had in there were really, really good, and they made really, really good use of a GoPro camera. And so that's where it was inventive. And so there were a couple of scenes there with the appearance of the ghosts that I did find myself like at night just being weirded out and having a hard time actually going to sleep. So yeah, that would be fairly recently.
Now, people are throwing some questions in the chat here. So Chance is saying, earlier you mentioned the staying in a haunted house, a supposedly haunted house, and he wants to just kind of maybe a bit more about that. And also a couple of people, including Chance, are asking, do you believe in the supernatural or have your own experience with that in any way?
So the haunted house where people stayed over, and Jonathan actually did it, so he can speak to it as well, is the Dalnavert Museum on Carlton. That it's a historical museum. It's an old mansion. It used to belong to Sir John Macdonald's son, and yeah, it's now like a museum that you can go in and take tours and stuff. But it is supposedly haunted. So the 4 writers and a staff member stayed there overnight to work on stories. I did hear that one of the staff members did have a ghost story that I thought was pretty good. It does have a very, very old, very creepy basement. The basement is really spooky. And so I guess one time after some sort of party, they had set up stuff down there, and this one staff member was the only one left in the house, and she was cleaning up, and she was just tidying up in the basement, and she heard a noise on the stairs, like someone coming down, and she's like, "Oh, okay, must be a guest or someone who lost or just has a question." And so she turns around and she says, "There was a man at the foot of the stairs who then ran at her full speed." And he ran so fast that she flinched and turned away. And then when she looked back, he was gone. And then there was nobody there. So that is one of the stories of this old spooky house. I personally don't have a ghost story. I haven't actually experienced anything. I love the idea of ghosts, like in terms of the horror tropes or the certain monsters or things. Ghosts are my favorite. I really, really am interested in ghosts. I don't know. Are they real or not? My mom has a ghost story actually that when her mother died, my grandfather's favorite food was fried eggs, but he had really bad cholesterol late in his life, so she would only allow him to have one fried egg a week. She would make it for him. And so when she had died, rather, sorry, not to get confusing, when my grandmother died, and all my aunts and uncles were there with my grandfather, and one of my aunts said, "Oh, you've got to eat something. Why don't we make you something you'll actually eat? How about I make you a couple of fried eggs?" I was like, "Okay, sure." So she went into the fridge to get eggs, and when she went to try to fry them, they were all hard boiled. That not like so they couldn't fry any of them, and so they think that was her making him stick to his weekly limit.
That's funny. So you're undecided on the ghost question then? That's another question
I'm
Roger
pretty
let in
undecided.
chance
Yeah,
both of us.
leaning more to no. but like I said, I'm incredibly fascinated with them. I watch a lot of, like even like Ghost Hunters and all those terrible, terrible shows. I still get suckered into watching those. So I really like the idea of a ghost and that they might exist and what they purport to mean. But in terms of like actual real, I don't know. I'm a fairly skeptical, cynical person. So
Sure. There's a lot of questions that's kind of connected to your writing craft and your process, and then some, connected to maybe sort of more your taste and interest in horror. So I'm just going to kind of synthesize a couple that I see coming in. One is just coming off the haunted house. So how did staying in that house influence your writing for that night, or kind of coming off of that experience? And sort of tied into that is maybe the question of what are the ways that you kind of what sort of gives you that, as the way that Renat puts it, is what gives you that click to kind of start or frame a plot for a story. She sort of has the idea that Renat has the idea, horror is all around, is not around us, and necessarily at all times, right? Like, so what kind of is the thing that clicks in your head to grab your interest? And did anything in that haunted house, do that?
so yeah, like for the haunted house, that was more that I edited the stories that the other writers came up with while they were in the house. But the idea of like setting up the event and what like being in a haunted house might do is just like sort of absorbing the tone of it, the feel. So like a big part of horror stories and making horror stories work is their overall tone. Like they have to feel scary for them to work. And the best way to sort of get at artificially creating that in your story is to be very well versed in an environment that makes you feel that. And so being in an old creepy house that like makes all kinds of weird noises, is really dark because the wiring in it is all really old, so there's lights in weird places. That is just something where, and then you're told that it has ghosts in it. It's going to give you that feeling, and then so while you're there immersed in the space, you can sort of pick up on details that are feeling sort of odd, or that strike you in an interesting way. So what was interesting about all those stories, so we did it twice. So there's been a total of 8 different writers who have gone through this experience. What I found interesting in editing all those stories is they often picked up on a lot of the same details that they found creepy. So there were quite a few like taxidermied animals in the house. Everybody picked up on those. There was really, really old solvents and drugs and stuff in the medicine cabinet in the bathroom, just like odd powders and unguents, just weird things that struck everybody as odd and that stood out. There's a stained glass window in that house, so quite a few people zeroed in on that. And so something like that, where you have a shared environment and you're seeing what multiple people are picking out as off-putting or dread-inducing, is, you know, like that's quite effective in terms of how to set a tone in the story. And so that was the main reason for like the haunted house, was to instill that feeling and see what different writers would do, being immersed in that sense. In terms of what makes me want to explore a story, it often starts with like a fairly small creepy idea or an image that I find really like, oh, that's great. My partner Lindsay always finds it weird that when it's something really disturbing, that my reaction is, that's awesome, and I want to delve deeper into it, rather than, that's horrible, I don't want to look at that anymore. So I have one of my stories is about a young boy in like the Victorian era who has to sit for a photograph with the corpse of his mother. And so this is at a time when photography would take like a couple of hours to expose a photo. So you've got to stay very, very still. And at that time, it was really common to take pictures of dead bodies, just because you wouldn't get a lot of pictures of somebody. And because you had to stay still for so long, dead bodies were perfect. They didn't move. But one of the weird things was that they would prop up live people next to the bodies so that you would get a family photograph. And so I had seen some of these on the internet, just pictures of like these real portraits and photographs, and they're horrifying. They're so odd. And yeah, I just deep dove on that idea, and I got really, really interested in it. And it was something where the idea was festering for a long time before I sort of broke the story of it, of like, how is this going to be an actual story that's got a plot and everything. So the main idea was just like, these pictures are really creepy. And then it took me a while to settle on, well, the story is the experience of the live person who's got to sit there and sort of endure this process, and what effect does it have on them. So the story really centers on the boy is horribly scarred from having had to do this. But it's started from like this fairly simple image online that I then went down the rabbit hole and got really interested in.
Kind of along those lines, Octavian wants to know is scaring the reader the most important part of a horror story, or should things like themes or the messaging or something else come first?
It's incredibly, like, it's impossible to predict whether or not readers will actually be scared. So like I had said, that I still get, like, I do encounter things that still creep me out and that I do find scary. But in terms of like what they are, it's hard to tell what that's going to be. And I still really appreciate stories that don't necessarily give me that visceral terror, but I can appreciate the other things that are going on in there. So it's a little bit of both. I think that if you're writing a horror story, like, absolutely, you want to scare at least somebody. But I think I'll steal an idea from Stephen King, and that I tend to write about things that do scare me. so that at the very least I've scared myself. I've explored an idea that I find scary, and that's at least a good starting point in the hope of scaring somebody else. So yeah, like these photographs unsettled me, and that was the start of a story. So that's usually where mine gets started, is I'm the first one unsettled by it. um and but then, like, in terms of theme and imagery and like what the message is and the other, like, those are very, like, also very, very important, and those are things that instill a horror story with sort of that literary importance. Like, why read it if it's just a matter of scaring, like, that becomes desensitizing. And you can go watch the Saw movies, and they get stupider and stupider and stupider, but the gore is working. Right? But they're dumb as nails, like, they're stupid, like, there's nothing redeeming in there, but they're fun. Whereas something that's a little bit deeper, and it may even not unsettle you until you start to unpack those deeper those deeper themes and images, and like, what is this story actually trying to say in terms of its scariness. Like, so like a good example of something like that, where it is scary and it gets worse the more you sort of absorb its message, would be something like Beloved by Toni Morrison, which is a horror story. It's very much high capital L literature, but it's a ghost. It's a ghost in a haunted house, like, absolutely. But in terms of what it's exploring, um, is like this. It's a slavery story, so it is about absolute horrendous human behavior. And as you explore what has happened to this woman, to Setha, the main character, and what she has done and why this ghost has come back, that's when it really becomes unsettling. And it's the slavery, and it's the cruelty inflicted on these people by other human beings. Like, that's the scary part of the book. The ghost is not scary. It's the circumstances, the historical um, lens of, like, of what it's telling you has happened to people. Like, that's the scary part, and it gets under your skin when you go back to it and when you look at it more closely like that.
And then just kind of connected in here is just a broad question is, do you have any favorite horror stories or recommendations along these sorts of lines?
Definitely one of my favorite authors of horror is Thomas Ligotti, um, who is a short fiction writer, a famous hermit and recluse. But his stories are really creepy and bizarre. So they would be a good example of ones that have left me unsettled in ways that I wouldn't quite expect. And his stuff is quite old. Like, his first book came out in the 80s. They've been reprinted, so there's a Penguin Classics of two of his story collections.
They've
And
read Notes on the Writing of Horror, just to throw in here. So
yes,
they, a little bit
exactly.
of Ligotti is, if you want to talk about that story specifically in any way.
So that's one that really stayed with me because it was so funny. It starts out very, very goofy, and then it sort of, um, as it gets darker and darker, it pulls off this twist at the end where, like, the haunted pants really are, a scary thing, rather. Like, at the start, it's just like, let's imagine haunted trousers. Like, this, it seems like, oh, what's the dumbest thing? What's the dumbest example? And by the end of the story, it's not dumb anymore. It's great. It's so good. But Ligotti has a lot of stuff like that, where the opening instant, or like, there are things throughout it that are quite silly. And then as you go on, the silliness just sort of becomes more and more off kilter, and to the point that it is really quite scary and creepy. So he's a great example of someone I really, really like. Shirley Jackson is another ultimate favorite. I think you guys did Hill House on your list, but some of her other stories, like her novels, are really fantastic. And something like, again, like, just a pervasive sense of, like, something is off, And that really makes the whole story like infused with dread. And so like Hill House definitely works that way. We Have Always Lived in the Castle is another one of her more famous books that has like a similar, like something really odd is going on with what's happening. And so like that story is revolves around two sisters who live like in the burnt out husk of their mansion and can't leave because the townspeople have tried to scare them out, and they just sort of stay in there. And her sister never leaves, and the narrator is the only, she goes into town like once a week to get provisions and then goes back. And so it's only like as you read further and further, you start to find out their relationship to the town, and like there is something really off with the story, but she builds to that. Yeah, so that's two definite favorites there.
Denise had asked that question, and Bailey also has a question, kind of, which is just who is your favorite author at the moment? Was it those two, or is it somebody else right now?
I actually just finished Mariana Enriquez's first story collection, which is Things We Lost in the Fire. That is excellent. I was really, really impressed and enjoyed that one a lot. Um, yeah, that's probably the most recent like horror one that I really, really latched onto. Um, there's lots of others that are just I'm always watching for their new stuff, but that aren't necessarily like most in the moment exciting discoveries. But Carmen Maria Machado is also really great. I like her stuff a lot. Laird Barron, who he does more crime now, but his earlier horror stories are really good. I'm just looking at my bookshelf here. I'm a big fan of Nathan Ballingrud, who is not as well known, but if you've heard of the show Monsterland, that was based on his story collection, which was originally called North American Lake Monsters. It has been re-released as Monsterland. That's a really, really good collection, really interesting in terms of like being very literary and being horror as well. Yeah, I could go on for a really long time.
You talked a little bit about this thing, but Gemma's wondering, when you develop a story, would you kind of begin first with the plot or with, say, a monster? And Nicole kind of connected to this, I think, is wondering what's your favorite type of horror story, like either to write or to read. So I don't know if those two things are connected for you or not, but those are sort of two questions that seem to me like they might have some.
Um, so yeah, in terms of like, do I start with like a plot or a monster or like the nugget of scary? Like it usually tends to start with the nugget, like something, the main scary thing usually occurs to me first, and then I spend a long time trying to break the story, to use like a TV term, like where you're trying to figure out how we're going to get from point A to point B. So I'll have a really good idea of like this. I know this is scary. How can I make a story out of it? And so that's usually what takes the longest is figuring out a plot. So that like comes later for me. It also makes my writing really slow. So I find it like I'm not a very good outliner in terms of like sitting down and actually figuring out an outline. But what I'm essentially doing is trying to come up with individual scenes or characters or a circumstance that can get me to this scary nugget from the beginning. So like writing around this big incident until I've figured out, okay, now I've got a story. And then that's sort of a roundabout way of getting to an outline. And then like once that's happened, then I can get all the way through a first draft and it's plotted. But that can take some time, and it sort of like works in a roundabout way. And so like to use the photograph story again, like as an example, like that's what I started with. I wrote a scene just about the picture itself, and then I wrote around, well, what about the scene where they take the picture, what does he do with the picture after? And so like these things sort of built around themselves, and then eventually like I had to like restructure it and just, move it around and get it into like a point A to point B situation. But I started by writing like short snippets around the big payoff, which was the picture of this boy and his dead mother. So that's happened with other stories as well, where it'll be in incidents. And so like I don't have a lot of monster stories, but I do have one with a Wendigo. And so that started with like the Wendigo is such an awesome monster. It's such an intriguing idea. So it started with that. I was like, I want to do a Wendigo story, and then that took a while to figure out what would be a good Wendigo, like what would be a good plot, what should happen, and so that it built around the central idea. So that's definitely where I start, is a central idea. In terms of the kind of stories I really like to read, I tend to really gravitate to stuff like that, like the same idea where there seems to be a nugget like that where I want to like peel back the layers and get to this scary idea. So I'm definitely a fan of the slow burn horror story, where it's very quiet at the beginning, builds up to, you know, like ramping up of tension until you finally get to the end, and you're so on edge, you're so keyed up that that it really sort of knocks you off balance. So movies that are like that would be something like The Witch, the Blair Witch Project, where like if you just take 5 minutes out of it, it looks very boring. But when it like the cumulative effect of watching it all the way through, and then the ending of those two movies in particular, where they seem like very quiet endings, but if you've been immersed in it all the way through, and then like both are, I'm hoping at least everybody is familiar with those two movies. You know, not trying to spoil endings or anything, but if you haven't heard of those, you won't know what I'm talking about. But they're pretty classic examples that are, you know, popular culture now. But in terms of like books that sort of pull that off, Ligotti does that, of course. Something like House of Leaves was a book that really unsettled me, but it's a huge slog. Like it is a massive book. It's one that I am very, very happy to have read. I loved it. I don't know that I would ever read it again because it's a challenge. It's a really hard book to read. But like even just because the physical book itself is big and awkward, and it's like that on purpose. So that is a book that really mirrored form and function. That like trying to figure out what's going on is difficult, but the experience of piecing it together is unsettling and odd. And that's one too where like the basic premise of it is hidden under so many layers of extra stuff. But the basic idea of the story is that this guy discovers that his house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. That when he does all the measurements, it doesn't match. That when he measures the outside of the house, it should be this many square feet inside, this many square inches. And when he measures it on the inside, they don't match. They don't ever match. It's always a little bit bigger on the inside of the house. And then, so that gets into, there's an urban legend that there is like a homemade documentary of the house. And so the text, the book is someone reading the notes of a film scholar who has apparently seen this movie, and he is dissecting it, and buried under all that is this story of this house in there, that there's something really, really off and wrong and supernatural about the house itself. And so that was I love that book, and it is something where I was really drawn to the like I wanted to get at like why is the house bigger on the inside than the outside. Like that drove me through like a 1,500-page book. So that was definitely I was hooked on the premise and wanted to dig at it. So those tend to be what I gravitate to.
Kind of connected to this idea of the form, Shelby wanted to know why'd you choose to write gaze in the form of a journal?
That was, well, a journal, like a first person narrative, is a kind of reflection, right? So like the whole novel centers around mirrors. He's staring at himself. The journal is another way of looking at him, but it's more internalized. And so like one of the central images of Gaze 2 was the the actual term for it is mise en abîme, which is French, but it's like when you have two mirrors lined up and it just bounces, the image goes on forever. So that's sort of like a journal can sort of do that kind of internalization. Like once you start delving into somebody's mind, there's no end to it. Like you can just dive into it forever. And that was something too where, because the tension of that story and the scary part is what's happening to him, is what's going on in his mind rather than the outward experience. So like watching him outside sitting in the room by himself, that's not actually scary. It's the internal conflict that is actually giving that story tension. And in terms of plot, like very little happens in that story, right? Like it's pretty simple, but it all boils down to like the creepy part is what he thinks is happening. So that's why that was told as a journal, because the horror there is the internal conflict of the character rather than the plot or the outward happenings. So that would make it more of a psychological horror story than an outward horrific. Like, there's no monster really.
I just want to connect something you said to some of the course concepts real quick. There's a story. There's a poem that we read called Ishmael Reed's poem. Beware, do not read this poem. So now, when you mentioned mise en abîme, there is also, in addition to that, the way that it actually is meant, there's also a way that it's used in literary studies. This is just sort of a note for people. There's a way that mise en abîme phrase is used in literary studies. It comes from I'm blanking all of a sudden on this person who came up with it, but it's used in literary studies to refer to a story inside of a story that is also a metaphor for the overall story. So in the Ishmael Reed poem, for example, the thriller plot, where the woman haunts the mirror and is pulling people into it, that's technically speaking, in terms of like literary terms, that's a mise en abîme, story inside of a story that is also mirroring the actual thing that's happening in the Reed poem, where it's purporting to pull you into the poem and so on. So that's just a really technical kind of connection between that concept and how it kind of gets used in some of these meta horrors. And you see versions of that in other stories, but I think the Reed one's the most obvious. But just kind of to jump ahead to a more new piece of writing by you. So the most recent book that you published is Signal Decay. Kiara wanted to know what specifically kind of influenced the ideas for that story.
That one would be again, like started with something simple. Was the laugh track idea. So for those who haven't read it or aren't familiar with this story, so it centers on Lori, whose husband Tim has recently died very unexpectedly. He was a sound engineer, and she is going through all his old stuff after he's died, and she's going through all his old his audio files, looking for any recordings of himself. So he didn't actually record himself. He recorded all these other things, and so she's hoping desperately to find a audio recording of him, something he said, something he's interested in, and so she goes in this deep dive of really getting obsessed with looking for him in terms of sound, and she hears a laugh track on a TV show, and she's convinced that she can hear his laugh embedded in the soundtrack. And she's trying to figure out how that could actually be. And so that came from, again, like a weird thing I found on the internet, which is a great hovel of nonsense that occasionally you'll find something really interesting. But I can't remember how I found it, but it centered on this device, which was called the Charlie Douglas Laugh Box, which was an old audio engineering invention from like the 50s, and it's how they created laugh tracks for TV shows. So what they discovered when they started like filming sitcoms, and so one of the shows that is mentioned in Signal Decay is I Love Lucy, which is a show I really liked as a kid. It's horribly sexist. It's really quite something to watch it now. But it was the very first show that was actually recorded and filmed. So it was the first show that had reruns. Everything else was like there were cameras and there was an audience present, but it was shot live and then it was gone. So I Love Lucy was the first one recorded, so then you could rewatch it. You could watch another episode of it. And they filmed in front of a live audience, and so there was laughter when the jokes hit. And they very quickly realized that people liked watching those shows more. That if there was this communal experience of laughing, they tended to get bigger laughs and better laughs. But it was really expensive to film in front of an audience all the time, and like if shows moved outside or it had more than one location, it became just basically impossible to always have an audience present in order to have the laughs. So they tried to record just laughing in order to put it where they wanted in the mix of the show. And then they also discovered that like when jokes were bad and didn't land, if you put the laugh track on it, you tricked people and then they would laugh at it even though it was stupid. That would be, a good example of how something like the Big Bang Theory tricks people to think that it's funny, because it's not. But anyway, so this sound engineer came up with this idea of the laugh box, and he recorded thousands of individual laughs and assembled them all in this machine, and then he would custom make a laugh track for each show. So it was never the exact same laugh track. It sounded like a dynamic, organic audience, but it was just him dicking around with this machine that he had invented. And it's a real machine. It really exists, and it turned up on Antiques Roadshow once, and this collector scooped it up because he knew what it was. And apparently, all the laugh tracks that still exist that are like part of a digital library. Like every studio just has access to the same library, so they keep using them. They're apparently all still taken from the recordings in this box. That they don't record laugh tracks anymore. They just use these same old laughs from the 50s and 60s. So that to me felt like a ghost story in and of itself, that these are ghost laughs. Like those people aren't there. They aren't laughing at this thing. They're being sort of exercised and put in to something modern. And that's like where the main idea for that story really came from. And when it first started, it was more scary. Like I was more going for like a spooky haunted thing. And then just as I broke the story, as I figured out what the plot was, it turned out much more melancholy and introspective. So like Signal Decay is like there's a little bit of creep factor. It's creepy, but it's not really scary. So it's much more of an emotional, sad story than a horror story. But it's started with this sort of ghostly haunting idea.